The crew, the captain.
If everything he does is to satisfy and then to benefit at the expense of his subjects, then what kind of a community is he creating on board his ship? Tyranny. If everything he does is to fatten his own wallet against the expense of the patient, then he is malpracticing, because it is accepted that if there is this kind of relationship based upon this assumption that these kinds of functions are higher than any other. Let's see if we can put it again in another way. Suppose I say that we can put here a bank robber, right, and his victims. Has knowledge. He must protect himself. He cares for himself. He makes a diagnosis of the bank, careful, thoughtful, plans a certain approach, a methodology. He follows it carefully. He executes it with great skill. What makes him different from these people?
Doesn't have an MD.
Pardon?
Sorry.
That's good.
So it's a question of ethics.
Robs his victim, doesn't benefit.
Benefits himself.
Only benefits himself, and is the victim made worse or better?
Worse.
Therefore, it can't fall into this class. This is the first mark of what we mean by an art. That's what we mean by an art. That the primary benefit must go to the subject and never to the practitioner. So therefore, you see, if all of these people now, by that I mean this set, including the coach and the athletes, put a dentist and his patients in the same way, if they are to receive any benefit, it's not a consequence of them studying medicine or running a ship and being a shepherd. It must be because they must learn something in common that has nothing to do with their art, but a skill which they all can share into, and that's the skill in handling business affairs, contracts, right? How to collect and how to assign fees. Now, this is a skill they all must have, and therefore the degree to which two physicians are functioning ideally in exactly the same way, one can be far poorer than the other, and yet they may be equal as great physicians.
There's one other point, they have to develop confidence that they know what they're doing. The patient has to have confidence that they really, he has to have an aura of like the physician needs a bedside manner.
Yeah, he may though, but then he may be trying to persuade the patient to be his patient,
Right.
and therefore he's not looking out for the good of the patient, but the good of his business, in which case we might be suspicious of his motives.
But they say sometimes the patient gets well just because he has confidence in the doctor. He might not just give him placebo.
Oh, absolutely. In which case, if the physician found out that a placebo would work, he wouldn't charge him. Now look here, we got something new now. Here we have something new. For each of these people to function on the highest level, they have to cultivate an ideal. Without that ideal, they can't function on the highest level of their art. Let's see how we can see that, right? When that sad and tearful patient came in, remember? And now he's somewhat better, right? All through the process, here's our doctor, and we'll see whether it applies to all of these. During every phase of the treatment, where he has to be careful to follow it up, would you not agree to make sure that the patient is functioning most perfectly with the treatment? He has to have this sense of time. He must have to have some idea that certain things progress at certain rates. He must also have the idea that there's a certain condition for children, for people in teens, etc., etc. And therefore, he has to have an idea of health. He must have an ideal of health. And the sharper that ideal is, would you not agree, the more effective his diagnosis will be, because would you not agree a diagnosis is nothing other than a subtraction. It's the ideal minus the condition of the patient or the subject. That difference, right, is the way in which he separates from the ideal, and the physician then must try to bring the subject through stages in the treatment to come closer and closer to that ideal, which is capable through the medical art. Now, that ideal of health is non-sickness, and we'll return to that, or non-illness. We'll return to this idea in a little later. Because well, let me just add something to it now. Would you agree the doctor wants to make sure that whatever injury and sickness the patient is afflicted with is handled correctly? And by correctly means that it is eliminated, and to the degree that it's eliminated, to that degree the person can be restored, not necessarily to health, but to non-illness. Now, the treatment may have left him exhausted, he may be weak, but over the particular illness. Therefore, to bring him to this pure idea of healthiness, he has to send him to someone else, and that might be a gymnast, who can then take that condition, since the person is no longer sick or injured, and work with him to develop an ideal condition, which then is sound, perfect health. Let's move on. By the way, would you agree then the captain has to have an ideal of a perfect journey, has to have a very clear idea of what constitutes a good crew working together. He has to have a good idea of what seaworthiness the particular ship may have, because he has a perfect idea. The better he has, the better it is, of course, of what is a seaworthy ship. Would you agree with that? A shepherd, too, must have an idea of what it is like to bring a group of sheep together up into the high mountains and bring them back so that they are in better shape than he started out with. As a matter of fact, more ideal. Therefore, he must have an ideal. Right? Every one of these people, therefore, must have an ideal, or they couldn't really be effective in their diagnosis. Without that, their functioning is minor. Now, let us say these people came together. That's easy for me to draw, of course, because I have this rare skill. Right? And he'll be sitting. Right? And of course, since they're all knowledgeable, right, they're drinking cappuccino. And they all recognize that, by heavens, even though they have different knowledges, each one of them they recognize has an art. Each has an art. And so they sit around and they share their views of how they got to that point of being able to function with an art. And I think this is the way the dialogue must have gone. To master the art, number one, they had to have at their disposal a certain degree of time. Ideally, no end of good time to study whatever it is that's going to be their art. Right? No end of time. Freedom to study. Right? The opportunity, taking advantage of sacrificing everything in order to master the art. But whatever it is they're going to study, they're going to first, if they approach it right, and if they're guided right,